Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So, if you want to develop the virtues, think of it like a sport, think of it like an instrument. It's going to have to become something that is a habit. You've got to put yourself in situations where you develop it. It can help if you watch other people who do it, if you talk to other people who do those virtues and are good at them, how they develop them. But in the end, you're going to have to put yourself in situations where you practice it. Like you're going to have to put in the hard work to become patient, put in the hard work to become self disciplined. It's going to take some sweat, but your life hinges on it. So it's really not an option unless again you want to live a miserable life with a garden full of weeds and thistles. In which case, feel free to go for it. Um, so, with that said, one of the things that can be helpful is actually thinking about your virtues, the individual virtues that you need. Because each virtue has things that you have to think about and sort of the dynamics that go on with it. So I want to look at three virtues today, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of practice trying to think from the perspective of a virtue ethicist, because you're going to come to ethical dilemmas very differently. There are going to be a lot of correct answers, and you're going to have to make judgment calls on which answers are ultimately the best. So I want to start with phobias. What's one phobia that you have? One of my phobias is lions. So let's say that I take this closure of zoos, which they're all closed right now across the United States, as an opportunity for me to develop the virtue of courage. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sneak into a zoo and sneak into a lion enclosure, hopefully while the lion's not looking, and then I'm just going to stand there for 30 seconds and take some deep breaths and start to overcome my fear, which isn't that's the definition of courage, right? Overcoming your fear. I'm going to overcome my fear of lions. Is this action courageous? Why or why not? So some people will say that this action isn't courageous. It's actually stupid because there has to be a significant purpose behind taking a risk. And overcoming a phobia, risking your life to overcome a phobia, doesn't seem legitimate. Whereas if you're trying to protect innocent children in a war zone, that would be a legitimate purpose. The second thing that people find with this is that it's sort of, we talked about in the crash course, Aristotle's mean. Every virtue is between two extremes. If you have too much of it, you're foolhardy. It's just nuts. If you don't have enough, you're a coward. Virtue is the virtue of courage, I should say, is somewhere there in between. And what I'm doing is I'm using way too much of it, so it no longer becomes a virtue. Second question. I go out to eat, let's say with my wife, when restaurants open back up, and we go to a very expensive restaurant and drop, let's say, $130 on the two of us, which I would never do. But let's say that that's what my wife and I decided to do to celebrate the end of the coronavirus. We go out for dinner and drop $130, and then when I walk out of the restaurant, I give a quarter to a homeless person, 25 cents to a homeless person. Was that generous? Why or why not? And some of you are going to say yes because I didn't have to give anything and I gave something. Some of you are going to say no because it doesn't actually impact the person's life. So, of the with the virtue generosity, we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. How much money, time, energy must I give for it to be generous? And does it require self sacrifice? Because it would seem that you might say that it's kind that I gave 25 cents, but I don't think it's what we would call generous. It's a difference between kindness and generosity. Generosity seems to entail that I'm giving up something that I need or want to somebody else. That's when somebody crosses that threshold and becomes a generous person. But again, you can't go too far. If I say to my wife, I just quit my job and sold the house and gave all of our money away to the poor, that would be too much because now my wife and my kids would be in that situation. So Generosity has to be thought of as well as a balance, and you have to ask yourself, what about sacrifice? A third example virtue. Um, Student comes home on a Friday night and is stoned. Walks in the door, parent says, "Have you been drinking?" Student says, "No." "Good night," and goes to bed. Was the student being honest? Why or why not? The key to the answer to this one is that virtue ethics, again, wants you to be flourishing. And to flourish means to truly have these virtues deeply rooted in your life. So if you are only technically telling the truth, then you really aren't an honest person. So in this case, you have to set the bar higher than a technical truth. The student was not being honest because they knew what their parents wanted to know, which is that, are you under the influence of something? Just because the parent didn't guess the right substance doesn't mean that they were being honest and truthful. It's sort of like a wife saying to her husband, "Have you been having an affair with Jane?" He happens to be having an affair with Sally. So he says, "No, I'm not having an affair with Jane. Can we go out to dinner now?" Would you say that the husband was an honest person? Would you pat him on the back and say, I just think it's remarkable how honest a human being you are? No, because he's withholding the truth. So honesty requires a pretty high bar. But, and this is important to learn, not just with honesty, with other virtues, there are times when another virtue should trump another. Trump means cancel out, beat. So if your friend says, "How do I look today?" and they don't look great, can you lie and tell the small lie to be kind? So we're using another virtue, kindness, to trump honesty. I would say so. In some cases, you can. Can you lie to save a life? So hiding Jews in Nazi Germany, can you lie? Yeah, because you're taking the virtue of justice and you're placing it over honesty because you're saying that justice is the most important virtue in this situation. And when we get to the examples that I'm going to have you guys do, it's going to be this type of back and forth between two different virtues and deciding which one ultimately should win out, because that's one of the fundamental characteristics of virtue ethics. So honesty. Fourth one, loyalty. Um, if your brother had killed an innocent person and he says, "Please don't tell anybody," would you keep it a secret or would you go to the police? Let's say there was no legitimate reason for him to kill this person. What would you do? The virtue here is loyalty. And the question is loyalty always a good thing? If you're loyal to a murderer, would I say, you know what? Your loyalty there looks so beautiful. It's such a wonderful thing that you're loyal to people that kill innocent people. Like if you're loyal to the mob or to a gang, could I say, you just shine. You're just a flourishing human being because your loyalty is such an example of what a human should be like when your loyalty is to criminals. No. So another broad characteristic of virtues is that they have to be tied to justice. They have to be tied to that most important virtue, or it no longer is beautiful. It's no longer something that's good. If we go back to courage, is a suicide bomber courageous? Well, they're overcoming their fear, but they're killing innocent people. So a terrorist, their virtue of courage is no longer a virtue because it no longer allows them to flourish and look beautiful. So justice has to be a part of virtues. When you think through the virtues that you need, there are things like this to think about. Let's say, for example, self-discipline. You can be too self-disciplined. So you have to be careful. You have to look on that continuum and find out where you stand. You have to look at whether the individual virtue has a specific issue unique to it that requires some thought to get around. Because I can tell you that you can write a book on each virtue because there's that much that has been said about it and thought about it and developed about it, because virtues are just, they're very complex traits of human beings. So what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of practice, and I'm going to have you go to the form and think through a couple of scenarios where you have to list two virtues that would be used, that could be used. So I have two choices I can make, A or B. But it's not like with Kant where one is good and one is bad. It's where one is good and the other one's good. But um, you have to choose. So both of them will use both of the options will use a virtue, but one of those virtues should ultimately win out and trump and beat the other one. And that's what you're going to try to demonstrate, and you'll see with the examples it should make some more sense. Go ahead and jump over to that form.